Hello, today we're going to cover chapter one in the textbook. Chapter one is really just an overview, introduction kind of a chapter, and we should be able to breeze through it pretty quick. So let me share my screen here and we'll get started. And let's see. Okay, so I don't really go slide by slide. I just have the slide up because it's you know better than just my face anyway, and it helps make sure that I'm covering stuff. But basically, what we have, the criminal justice system is just talking about the overall system that we have set up through the government to hold people accountable for things that we define as criminal wrongs. And so we basically have law enforcement officers that enforce the law, and then it moves on to the court system to determine guilt or innocence. We have a correctional system to basically met out punishment and also to hold pretrial detainees under certain circumstances, and we'll talk about all of that basically later. But the overall goal here is that we need to have law and order. We need to have public order. And in order to do that, that means that we can't necessarily have unfettered freedom. Like, we are a nation that was founded as the land of the free and the home of the brave, right? So we like our rights. We like to be able to do what we want, but there have to be reasonable limits put upon our freedoms, because otherwise it becomes this kind of exercise in um, survival of the fittest, where if I can, beat you up, I get to take everything that you own or whatever, and so we have to have, in order to have a civil society, we do have to have some limits on the individual rights. However, we have a lot of protections in place, right, to try to prevent what we call tyranny, which is the government overstepping its responsibility to keep order and basically, causing people to feel like they're disenfranchised, like they don't have a voice, they don't have a say, they can't um, have any control. So, that being said, it's a balance that we have to strike between respecting the rights of individuals and then also protecting those rights in from being trampled on by the government. We talk about justice, right? Criminal justice. What is justice? And it's really founded upon a principle of fairness. We want things to be fair amongst individuals, and so that means that it's not fair that I should, not have the right to enjoy my property if somebody wants to come and take it from me, right? It's not fair. Even if that person is bigger and stronger than me and can beat me up and take it, it should not be, you know, uh, okay for that to happen. There's lots of crimes out there that we can kind of put in that category of, well, it's just really about fairness. So that being said, we want the different parts of our criminal justice system to work together towards the end of justice for all, right? We want to hold people accountable for criminal activity. We want to uh, allow citizens to be secure in their, rights and in their possessions. And we are worried about, again, when we have too much freedom, we worry about that being abused in the form of um, private citizens basically trampling upon other citizens and stealing and taking what doesn't belong to them and all of that. When we lean too much towards the public order side, then we worry about the government, you know, um, trampling on the rights of the individuals. It's what the American Revolution was all about with England, was that we didn't feel that we were represented, and that we were not heard by the government. And so we sought to establish our own government. So that being said, what we're shooting for, and when everything works the way it's supposed to work, our criminal justice system is supposed to protect the rights of the individuals to a large extent, but while still allowing us to hold them accountable for their criminal behavior. There are some that say that the system is broken, the system doesn't work the way it's intended, and unfortunately, it relies upon individuals, right? If so like I am a law enforcement officer personally. That's my job, right? And if I do my job, then that means that I get to bring cases to before the court, and ultimately it ends up being either criminal cases or not criminal cases or whatever. If I, if somebody reports to me that they've been the victim of a crime and I don't do my job properly, if I decide to ignore them, if I decide to blow them off, if I decide to not do um, any kind of a good investigation or anything like that, and that means that crime goes unanswered for, that basically it's not fair, the justice is not served because I dropped the ball. Likewise, if I do all of my due diligence and I do my work and I bring a case to the prosecutor and the prosecutor throws it aside, then again, the broken link in the chain is that individual. We do have several steps that are required in order for the justice system to play out, right? Somebody has to report a crime to us, right? That's step one, right? If we don't know about a crime, then we generally can't do anything about it. So it either has to be reported or it has to be witnessed or somehow or another come to the attention of law enforcement. Then law enforcement has to do their job and conduct an investigation and determine whether a crime took place. And then they have to drop the proper paperwork and put it to the court system, maybe make arrests, and so on. And then it's up to the court to decide, are we going to proceed with a criminal trial? And then from there, then it becomes the correctional system's responsibility to carry out the punishment set forth by the court. So we have these separate, distinct parts of the system that have to work together. And if any one of those is not doing what it's supposed to do, is not honoring or reaching its responsibilities, then the system doesn't work the way it's intended. So that being said, here are kind of what I just talked about, really, but the different parts of the investigation. And so law enforcement is responsible for investigations. We would also be responsible for making arrests as applicable. Sometimes the arrest happens before the court gets involved. So for example, if I stop a car, and that driver is intoxicated and I can prove it, then I will arrest that person on the spot for DWI. Or if I respond to a burglary in progress and I catch somebody red-handed coming out of a house trying to steal stuff, and I arrest them, you know. So sometimes the arrest happens before the court gets involved, and then sometimes, like a lot of times in like I'm a detective, so I get assigned things, right, that have already happened or haven't happened, and sometimes people have already been arrested, sometimes they haven't, and so frequently I will go ahead and get an arrest warrant before I even try to go out and arrest somebody, because I'd rather have it than um, than do the other way. Because when we arrest, and we'll talk about this more when we get into the law enforcement side, but when I make an arrest, without a warrant, you know uh, a probable cause based arrest, I have to submit paperwork to the court, and the court has to issue a warrant in Missouri within 24 hours of that arrest, and that's sometimes hard to get done. And so sometimes people get released from jail, and then a warrant comes down sometime later, and they have to get arrested again, and it's a pain in the butt. So I tend to like going ahead and getting that warrant ahead of time, because the nature of my cases is I can usually get that done. Whereas like patrol officers oftentimes make that arrest based on the PC, and then they have to get the warrant. Booking is when they go to jail, you know? So I figure out somebody's done something. I take them into custody. I bring them to jail, right? And Missouri does things differently than other states. So this first appearance, right? It's the first time that the person is appears before the court after they've been arrested, right? In Missouri, typically we have this 24-hour rule where they basically issue that warrant or don't issue that warrant within the first 24 hours. And so, and if they're arrested on a warrant, right, then their first appearance is usually their arraignment. So some of these terms kind of get interchangeable, or feel like anyway they get interchangeable. But if you think about it, your first appearance is the first time you're before the court, right? And the only thing that is doing is setting bail. And then also the court also should at every stage be making sure that they agree that there's probable cause to proceed. Because if at any stage that the court determines there wasn't probable cause, then that means that that person shouldn't be in jail. Preliminary hearing, depends on how the prosecutor wants to proceed, because they can charge by indictment, and they usually do on felony cases. And so, which that's a whole other thing. We'll get into that more in depth when we talk about the courts. But arraignment is where they get to enter a plea. An arraignment is they come before the court and they say whether they intend to plead guilty, not guilty, and then we proceed from there. In under the Constitution, the defendant has a right to a trial by jury. You know, um, other than like minor, very minor petty offenses, traffic offenses, and stuff like that, they uh, tend to not do that. But anything where there's a chance of jail time, something where they're going to be doing some time in jail, they certainly have the right to a trial by jury. It can be waived by the defendant. And you might ask yourself, why would the defendant want to do that? And the answer is the defendant may want to waive their right to a trial by jury if the nature of their crime is such that the jury would be more likely to be enraged by it, whereas a judge tends to be able to be more, because they see this stuff day in and day out, they tend to be a little bit less sensitive to that kind of stuff. And so sometimes when you have a person that's committed an egregious crime, they may want to just do a bench trial. But that is at the request of the defendant, and it is, because they have the right to a trial by jury if they choose it. Anyway, and once the trial process plays out, whether they go to trial and get convicted or whether they accept what's called a plea bargain, which is where they agree to plead guilty in exchange for a particular recommended sentence from the prosecutor. Either way, once either one of those things has happened, they're considered to be convicted. And once that person is convicted, then it moves on to sentencing. Sentencing is a separate proceeding. And the reason that it's a separate proceeding is because during the trial, there are a lot of rules on what can be admitted or not admitted against the defendant. And if there's certain things that are, if they were to be admitted as evidence in the trial, it would prejudice the jury against the defendant. And one of those things would be his history, right? Unless the history directly correlates to like the way that they commit the crime is the same every time and they do a particular thing that makes them unique or whatever, then they can talk about that as evidence, but character evidence or evidence suggesting that they're just a bad person or they have a propensity to do this kind of crime cannot be admitted as evidence, because just because a person has a propensity to commit burglaries doesn't mean that they committed this burglary on this date. So there's limits to what can be admitted in a trial at evidence. Once you've been convicted, right, then your guilt is no longer in question, and the judge can consider the character evidence to determine whether you're going to be sentenced on the higher end or lower end of the sentencing range for whatever you've been convicted of. And in times, they can even deviate from those sentencing ranges if there's particular things that would justify it. So that being said, the sentence or the punishment can range anything from literally a fine with no jail time and no nothing, all the way up to, the death penalty for a first degree murder case. And so there is a report that's done in the intervening time between the trial and the sentencing hearing, and the judge is going to consider a lot of things in that, and even like victims get to testify about the impact, and there's lots of things that can happen there at sentencing hearings. And so sentences can either be consecutive or concurrent, meaning that, if you get 5 years for this offense and 5 years for that offense, if you run them concurrent, that means that those 5 years get served together. You're serving the same amount of time for both crimes. If you're talking about concurrent or consecutive, that means that basically you have to complete one sentence before you start another. So you get 2 5-year sentences. If they're consecutive, that means you have to serve 5 years on one before you start serving 5 years on the other one. By and large, almost always sentences are concurrent, but that is sometimes judges will run sentences consecutive if, again, we're talking about egregious kind of crimes and stuff like that. Every defendant has the right to appeal, and the appeals process can drag out for a very, very long time, which is why the death penalty takes so long to impose, because this death penalty cannot be carried out until all appeals have been exhausted. And so it literally takes decades for that to happen. So we already talked about going to jail. But once you get convicted, you can go to prison as opposed to county jail. there's lots of different forms of supervision nowadays, electronic monitoring and the like. We'll talk about all that when we get to the corrections part. Um, we also talk about, when we get to the corrections part, we also talk about reentry. In other words, you've taken somebody away from society for a lengthy period of time, and now you're just going to dump them back out on the streets and expect them to not go back to their old ways. How are they going to support themselves? How are they going to get by? Where are they going to live? Who's helping them, if anybody, that kind of stuff. And so reentry is about trying to help transition people back into society so that they have a greater likelihood of being able to stand on their own. uh we talked about, go back talking about the balance that we're wanting, between government power and um the rights of the individuals and stuff, and due process is a big part of our constitutional protections, that we should always have the right to challenge the government, and we should always have a process by which we can do that. And so when we are, for example, when we are arrested, right, there is a limited amount of time that you can be held without charge. And when I say without charge, I mean without a court deciding that you should be charged, not the officer, the court. In Missouri, it's 24 hours. In a lot of other states, it's 48, but there is a limited amount of time because we don't want officers to be able to arbitrarily throw people in jail, and they sit in jail for a long time on charges that the court would never ever put against them, you know so we limit that. We also talk about, the first appearance and the um, arraignment, and the different parts of the court process are intended to create checks and balances, to say, you're not going to be held in jail for a lengthy period of time without it being basically approved by the court. And the Eighth Amendment, talking about cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail and excessive fines and stuff. We don't want the government to basically hold people in jail indefinitely or without good reason, and you should have the right to challenge that. We have the right to also, like, even in jail, like when you get disciplined and stuff, you have due process rights to challenge the write-ups, to challenge, the discipline. So it's fundamental fairness. It's about trying to make sure that anytime that we're depriving people of their rights to freedom, that they have the rights to have that challenge. So okay, so that's about it. All right. So we also, what we're doing now is basically an academic study of criminal justice system that really started about 100 years ago, where we started to try to research the causes of crime and um, what kind of approaches to crime um, work and don't work. And we also want a system that recognizes diversity, that we don't want to we don't want to punish people for just having different norms or different values or different belief systems or anything like that. We want and we want a criminal justice system that represents the community. So that's all for chapter 1. Like I said, it was just a big overview. So in my next video, we'll go do chapter 2. I'll do it as a separate deal. And I need to, find the thing. Have a good day.